it out. Today I've got a very different speed art than normal, as well as a very different purpose for the speed art. As I'm sure many of you guys saw in the news, there was a solar eclipse that passed over most of the United States just a couple weeks ago. So me and some friends decided to take a trip down to North Carolina to try and check it out and see if we could get a good glimpse of it. And since the drive for us was going to be so long, we decided to do the whole deal and go right for the center line. As I read and heard from quite a few people that 95% is even far different than the 100% coverage, so we wanted to go the whole deal if we were going to make the 10+ hour drive. Most of my friends left from Philadelphia, and I got a little bit of a leg up by leaving from Washington, D.C., and we headed down towards North Carolina. The expected travel time was just about 10 hours. Come to find out, 7 or 8 hours into our trip, after stop-and-go traffic for more or less the entire way, we found that there was a NASCAR race down in Tennessee that, in combination with all the traffic for the eclipse, was just totally shutting down this highway. Our trip was expected to be 8 hours on the first day and maybe another 2 on the second, and it turned out to be probably 10 or 11 on the first day. Unfortunately enough, we got up early Sunday and we were able to get to the campsite in those same 2 hours. My friends from Philly that did the drive straight took them just about 14 hours, so this was definitely a commitment for 2 or 3 minutes of coverage of the sun. I will say our last 2 hours of the drive was very scenic as we passed through the Smoky Mountains. It was early in the morning, so there was plenty of fog to go around, which definitely showed off why it was named the Smoky Mountains. And I got a few good clips of it as we drove in the car winding through those narrow mountain highways. Since we were on the center line, there was easily a couple hundred people that had made their way to our exact camping site, as well as there was tons around in the area. We went through what was a small mountain town and everything was totally packed up. All the shop workers and whatnot were definitely astonished but happy to have all the visitors. So to spice up this piece, I wanted to try to do kind of a pseudo 3D actual piece, where I'd both cut and draw on some cardboard and then tape it down or glue it down and see if I could get some three-dimensional shapes and layering. I've seen similar things done where you crop out objects in a photo, and then based on their distance from the camera, you offset them from that back canvas, which gives a bunch of added depth similar to like a pop-out book or something. So the proof of concept with the paper worked, so I figured the theory of the pop-out book was gonna work in the end with a little bit of cardboard and actual drawings. And then for the background image, I wanted to composite some of the photos I had taken down by the eclipse. One of the coolest things I found leading up to the eclipse was that the shadows down on the ground became very sharp. Normally on a sunny day there's a gradient between the edge of your shadow and as you get into the lighter area. When the moon covers the sun, there becomes a much more singular light source, which gives your shadows a near perfect edge. I also got a pretty cool video of the shadow rolling in over the hills as we approached totality. So unfortunately any video I was taking of the sun itself was just a little bit too far away, and it kind of just washed out all the data and turned out looking like a full sun in the end. But as the moon began to cover the sun a lot more, it became a little bit clearer that the shape was actually being picked up by the camera. I had a light filter much like those cardboard sunglasses everybody was wearing over the lens of my camera, which kind of gave it this yellow tinge. This is actually zero photo editing on the file itself. You can see that there are a ton of clouds actually covering it, which was quite the scare ahead of time, but we'll get to that later. Here you can see the sliver getting just a little bit smaller in between photos, all the way up to just a little speck on there. And at that point I decided to take the filter off my camera because it was safe to shoot otherwise. 2 notes about these photos are my exposure is actually pretty high, so that's why it looks really bright all of a sudden, but you can definitely see the noticeable eclipse shape. So I dropped down the exposure on my camera to try and get a more honest view of the eclipse. And although it's ending, the best part is when the eclipse actually comes out at totality and you get this effect called the diamond ring. It's a little less prominent in person, but on cameras there's a sweet lens flare that comes off of the top side of the moon. And thankfully, having changed the exposure on my camera, it lit up the clouds and everything just so perfectly. So I rapid fired and took a couple more photos before it got too bright and I needed to put the filter back on. Now back to having the filter on, the crescent shape looked very familiar to the original one. There was some movement, but I ended up getting some pretty cool lens flares that were also in that kind of crescent shape. So the photo collage I put together was a combination of both the photos I took during the eclipse and the night before. The area had a ton of mountains like I mentioned before, and it lent itself to have some pretty cool long exposure stuff. So the main image I picked was one with all the camping stuff in the background as well as a bunch of trees and whatnot. The long exposure lit up everything in the foreground because there was a fair bit of light around, and then the silhouette of the mountain in the background was really nicely complemented off of the night sky. You can see a teeny bit of light pollution over the mountain that is brought out with the long exposure, but man, you could definitely see the whole Milky Way out there. So flipping the other direction, I picked one of the images from the smokestack where there was actually more light pollution, but it gave kind of a cool colored effect once I did some color correction. And I decided to drop that behind the mountains. Then I composited one of the other photos from the night sky up and tiled it over a few times to stretch out that sky section. So I had a few ideas going into this about how I was going to stand off each layer of this piece, and unfortunately it took me till my third try to get something that was going to work consistently. I had a few empty Crayola markers laying around and I figured those would be a good solid standoff, so I started by chopping them up and cutting them down. Cutting was a little time consuming, but the bigger piece was they were not gluing down very fast, and I realized their size was going to be a little bit big compared to some of the areas I was going to need. So keeping with the cylinder idea, I thought I'd move over to straws and cut those up and then flare out the bottom so that it would be a little easier to glue down and it'd be pretty easy to cut. I can't say I looked into the specifics about why it was taking a lot longer for the super glue to dry on the plastic, but it seemed like I'd have to hold it there for 30 seconds or so, and with a bunch of these to make, figured that wasn't going to work. I ultimately ended up at cardboard, which might have been a first thought for some people. Unfortunately, it took me a while to get there, but I just ended up cutting them into little squares and gluing them up to different heights. The super glue dried really quick on these, as well as it allowed me to cut kind of small and very kind of tailored sizes. So after my quick paper test of seeing how folding and gluing down would work, I wanted something that was similar but had a little bit more rigidity. That's where I went with some thin cardboard as well. I took the rough side and then spray painted a couple coats of white paint over top. This would allow for a much easier surface to draw on with paint markers so that the paint's not setting in, as well as it's a nice white background so I don't have to worry about opacity on some of the lighter colors. I wanted to go with an off yellow fill on this piece to complement the kind of tungsten color that came from most of these street lights. The side of the tent and then the background over the mountain both had this very similar color into them, and I thought a piece would look nice alongside it. And then those kind of orange hues would also be complemented by that maroon 3D that I was going for. And to help add some extra shadow and depth, I did some gray colors and some pink colors within the yellow that I faded and mixed around to try and give a little bit more contrast as well as hit some light sources. They didn't blend great on the cardboard, but I took some precautious time to really work it through and try to make them pretty even gradients. And then in the 3D I went for a dark blue and a medium grade purple to complement that maroon color and give it some darker and lighter areas. These colors complemented each other a little bit better than in the yellow. I was able to get a little bit better blending here and really show off that 3D kind of depth look I was going for. So I had the sketch to base these letters off of, but since I was contouring them and twisting them, you had to really plan ahead to see which sections were going to go where and if I needed multiple pieces for different sections of the same letter. The I and the V were pretty straightforward. I just had the one cross on the V that was a totally separate section that I then glued on top. But then for the E, since it twisted and curved on top of itself so much, I ended up doing 5 separate pieces that needed to be then glued together to make the whole letter. So sizing here got a little bit tricky because I made the first section a little bit larger than I anticipated, and then it kind of trickled out that all the other sections were also going to be a little bit larger if I drew it to that scale. I had a little bit of finagling and trimming off some edges at the end to try and get the sizing not too overpowering for the whole piece. It was also interesting trying to keep these contours smooth when they did cross over one another. So what I found was easiest was to take the more complex areas like the last drop down and use that and fill it in with the other pieces and then sketch around it to try and size up everything else nice. I had a total of 4 prints made of that background image and ended up using 3 of them. One was obviously used for the most background layer that everything else was stacked up on, and then I used the other 2 to trim out the unique shapes that, the trees and the cars and whatnot took. I found that if you cut right to the edge of each piece and then tried to lay those on top, you ended up having a little bit of negative space in between where 2 objects meet. So taking that second sheet, I was able to actually cut some of the more near ground objects a little bit wider so they overcame some of that extra area that was once taken away between where cuts were. It's pretty straightforward from there as far as picking the distances. I basically picked the mountains in the back as 1 layer thickness and then worked my way up to probably 5, 6, or 7 pieces of cardboard in the most foreground layer. I found that you needed a couple pieces of cardboard in between each layer stack to really show any definition between the cutouts. The paper was naturally sagging a little bit, and if you really only had a millimeter of difference in height, you're not going to see much of the depth effect that I was going for. I'd say the cars in the tent that are nearest to the observer are probably about ½ an inch off the sheet. This is definitely a really easy effect to translate to any kind of object-oriented image, so give it a try if you have something that it might look cool with. Unfortunately, because there's really no hard edges around the Eclipse, I wasn't able to cut something out that looked natural enough to then have an offset over there, so I left that as the absolute back as well. You win some and you lose some. With the clouds looking as cool as they did, you can't exactly cut to a nice edge over there. But I'm not complaining, I think the end result comes out pretty nice. With that extra large E, I ran into some sizing issues, and that shows through especially well with me not planning out my 3D quite well enough. There isn't quite one vanishing point that all the letters are coming up of. So it works alright because all the letters are somewhat independent and they still sit on top of one another and give that extra depth effect. But had all of them been going to that same vanishing point, would have sold the piece as kind of a singular entity a little bit better. So there's definitely room to improve on this style for me, but I had a lot of fun then stacking up each of the letters and kind of trying to interwork them a little bit more than normal. So going back at the very end, I added some more shadows and stuff that were now not unique to just the same letter, but had been influenced, maybe the V over top of the E, added some extra shadows there. As well as I added some extra detail work around the letters to spice up just that flat, somewhat yellow color that was the full fill. This is kind of a funny piece because you might need like a 3D picture frame to actually store it, and then even maybe trickling in some lights on there would be extra bonus on those shadows. So I can't say I had the time to do that now, but maybe that's a future DIY project to really show off this piece. I'm definitely really pleased with the outcome, and it was a nice trial and error process to do a formal proof of concept for this kind of stacked up object-oriented image. And making those 3D letters was definitely a challenge in itself. There's plenty to be had next time around when I make something similar. Seeing as this is a pretty new process to myself, if you have any suggestions on ways to make it better, feel free to leave them in the comments section down below. If you enjoyed the video and want to show some support, be sure to spray that like button. It goes a long way. And if you liked the video enough, consider joining the crew by subscribing. This is definitely a new type of art piece for me, but I do reviews and other graffiti-oriented content all the time. I did forget to mention if anybody actually saw the Eclipse themselves and had some good stories or good images, feel free to share those in the comment section. I know I've seen some really impressive stuff already, and I'm sure some of you guys had some cool experiences as well. Be sure to check out my last video where I'm actually giving away some tiny pink stencil caps. These are super small stencil caps that work on the front of a can and give you really, really fine lines. And if that's not enticing, check out a random video YouTube thinks you might like. Thank you for checking out the video and showing some support to my art. It's gonna do it for me, guys. Peace.